There is a moment in every great story when the thing you built with your own hands, the thing you sacrificed for, bled for, believed in when nobody else did, starts to slip quietly through your fingers. Rick Harrison built something that had no business working. A pawn shop, not a studio, not a talent agency, not some carefully packaged Hollywood concept tested in front of focus groups. A pawn shop on the sun-baked streets of Las Vegas that somehow became one of the most watched television shows on the entire planet. He wasn't an actor rehearsing lines. He wasn't a personality hired to fill a role. He was a man who understood the value of things, who could pick up a broken pocket watch or a dusty signed baseball and tell you exactly what it was worth, sometimes down to the last dollar. With the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how. And America completely and utterly could not get enough of it. For years, Pawn Stars felt like something television had stopped trying to make. Something real, something honest. In a landscape drowning in scripted drama and manufactured emotion, here was a show where the stories simply walked in through the front door. Veterans carrying medals they could no longer afford to keep, families parting with heirlooms that held lifetimes of memory, collectors chasing something they couldn't fully explain. Rick stood behind that counter like a quiet king behind his throne, calm and sharp, always wearing that half-smile that told you he already knew something you hadn't figured out yet. But something has shifted. Something that longtime fans felt quietly at first, like a small chill in a warm room, and then louder, and then with a kind of real and specific disappointment that doesn't go away on its own. And Rick Harrison himself stands at the center of it. The question isn't simply what changed. The deeper question, the one that keeps surfacing in comment sections and fan forums and late-night conversations between people who genuinely loved this show, is why he let it happen. Whether he saw it coming, whether he could have stopped it. And whether Pawn Stars, the show that made history feel alive for millions of ordinary people, can ever truly find its way back to what it once was. Because what is happening now is not what anyone signed up for. Rick Harrison is not your typical television star, and that was always precisely the point. He didn't arrive from Hollywood with a publicist and a carefully engineered image. He didn't attend auditions or pitch himself to casting directors. He had a pawn shop on Las Vegas Boulevard, a razor-sharp mind for negotiation, and a father named Old Man who grumbled at the world with a comedic timing so perfect it couldn't have been written. That combination, raw and unpolished and completely genuine, turned into television gold. Pawn Stars became a cultural phenomenon in the truest sense of the phrase. People who had never once set foot inside a pawn shop found themselves suddenly fascinated by the world behind those doors. The history, the haggling. The deeply human stories attached to every single object that crossed that counter. Rick was the anchor of all of it, knowledgeable without ever tipping into arrogance, funny without ever trying too hard. Real in a way that television spends enormous amounts of money trying to fake, and almost never achieves. But the Rick Harrison that fans encounter today, the show they sit down to watch now, it carries something different with it. A weight that wasn't there before. A distance. A feeling, quiet but persistent, that something authentic has been carefully replaced by something that only resembles it. This is the story of how Pawn Stars changed. What Rick did and what he didn't do. And why so many loyal fans feel like they've lost something they didn't realize they were going to miss this much. Long before any camera ever pointed in his direction, Rick Harrison was doing something far less glamorous. He was figuring out how to survive. He grew up in a household that didn't come with financial comfort or safety nets. His father, Richard Benjamin Harrison, the man the entire world would eventually come to love as Old Man, was a no-nonsense force of nature. Strict, deeply practical. Not the kind of man who sat around encouraging his son to dream without a plan attached to it. Rick absorbed that lesson early, that if you wanted something in this life, you either worked for it or you found a smarter path to get there. School was never Rick's territory. He struggled academically in ways that traditional classrooms weren't built to accommodate, and he dealt with epilepsy during his younger years. A condition that made the already narrow paths available to him even harder to walk. But even inside those struggles, something was quietly developing, a genuine curiosity about objects, about the hidden histories they carried. About what things were actually worth beneath their surface appearance, beneath what people assumed or guessed or hoped. He started learning the hard way, the way people with limited options and sharp instincts always do. He studied the art of buying low and selling higher. He taught himself that value had almost nothing to do with what something looked like on a shelf. and everything to do with what the right person, in the right moment, would willingly pay for it. That instinct, that rare ability to read both an object and the human being holding it at the exact same time, became Rick's real education. No diploma, no classroom. Just years of accumulated understanding. When the gold and silver pawn shop finally opened on Las Vegas Boulevard, it was not a glamorous beginning. Las Vegas is a city engineered for distraction, built to pull people's attention in 100 directions at once, and running a small business inside that circus meant fighting for every customer. But Rick and his father built something that held, something that locals came back to, something that developed a reputation for honesty in a city not always known for it. Word spread that Rick actually knew what he was talking about, that even when he couldn't offer what a seller hoped for, he would explain his reasoning clearly and treat them like an adult. That history, that real and hard-earned expertise standing quietly behind the counter, became the invisible foundation that everything else would eventually be built upon. And then, without any grand announcement, a television producer walked through the door, not searching for the next celebrity, not scouting for someone to fill a role. Just drawn in by a shop that felt different, and by the people inside it who felt even more so. Nobody understood what was coming, not Rick, not Old Man. Not the small handful of regulars who treated the shop like an extension of their own living rooms. None of them had any idea that their ordinary world was about to become something that millions of strangers would feel personally connected to. What happened next would change all of their lives in ways none of them were even close to ready for. The cameras arrived, and something genuinely unexpected unfolded. Rick Harrison was natural on television in a way that simply cannot be rehearsed or manufactured. He didn't step into a persona. He didn't soften his edges for the audience or sharpen them for effect. He stood behind his counter and did exactly what he had always done, examined objects with real attention, told their stories with genuine knowledge, made his offers with calm confidence, and pushed back firmly when the situation called for it. The camera didn't have to work to find something interesting in him, it was already there. When Pawn Stars debuted, the response wasn't gradual or slow building, it was immediate, overwhelming. Viewers were pulled in not just by the remarkable objects that appeared on screen, but by the human chemistry that surrounded them. Old Man planted in the background with his running commentary on everything and everyone. Corey, Rick's son, constantly trying to prove that he belonged in the same conversation as his father. Chumley moving through scenes with a warmth and a lovable cluelessness that made everyone watching feel slightly better about themselves. And Rick, always Rick, at the center of all of it, holding the whole thing together with expertise and a dry humor that never oversold itself. The show reached into something America had been quietly hungry for, real knowledge delivered without condescension, real negotiation without cruelty. Real history made tangible through objects that had actually lived through it. A Civil War rifle wasn't a prop on Pawn Stars. It had been carried by someone. It had a story attached to it that existed long before it landed on that counter in Las Vegas. And Rick could trace that story while simultaneously, and without any apparent effort, calculating exactly what the market would bear for it today. That combination was genuinely electric, and audiences recognized it immediately. The gold and silver pawn shop transformed into one of the most visited destinations in all of Las Vegas. People lined up around the block not to buy anything, not to sell anything, but simply to walk through the door they had seen on television, to stand in that space, to exist briefly inside the world they had watched from their sofas. The shop required crowd management on a scale that would have seemed impossible to imagine during its earliest days. Rick Harrison, the pawn shop owner who had fought for every customer on Las Vegas Boulevard, had become a genuine and unlikely American celebrity. He appeared on talk shows. He published a book. He carved out a unique lane in popular culture as an accessible voice for historical knowledge. The kind of real expertise that institutions and museums spend extraordinary sums trying to recreate for audiences and almost never quite manage to pull off. For a meaningful stretch of time, everything Rick touched carried its own momentum forward. But fame of that magnitude doesn't stay clean. It doesn't leave the things it touches unchanged. It presses on people and institutions and relationships in ways that are slow at first and then suddenly all at once. It changes the thing that made the story worth telling in the very first place. And that change, barely visible in the beginning, then impossible to look away from, had already quietly begun. At its absolute peak, Pawn Stars was appointment television in the most genuine sense of the phrase. Families gathered, friends made plans around it. People who had no particular interest in history or antiques found themselves genuinely invested in what might come through that door on any given episode. Every single week carried the real possibility of something extraordinary, a letter signed by someone who had shaped the course of history, a weapon that had traveled through a forgotten conflict, a piece of jewelry that had moved across centuries and continents and somehow ended its journey on a counter in Las Vegas, waiting for someone who understood what it actually was. Rick was the guide through all of it, and his knowledge felt trustworthy precisely because it was genuine. When he called in outside experts, it wasn't a performance designed to manufacture suspense. It was an honest acknowledgement that some things fell outside even his considerable expertise, and that intellectual honesty, that visible willingness to say he didn't know something, made viewers trust the moments when he did know with complete certainty. The show also worked because of a human texture that most television can't buy. The people who walked through that door weren't extras or paid participants. They were real, and they arrived carrying far more than objects: a grandmother's ring, a father's carefully assembled collection, a veteran's medal representing something too heavy to carry any longer but too important to simply forget. Rick navigated those moments with a sensitivity that surprised people who expected a pure transaction. He was disciplined in negotiation, yes, but there was a consistent decency in how he treated the human beings on the other side of the counter. And that decency came through the screen without any effort to project it. Old Man Harrison became something genuinely unexpected, an unlikely television icon. His gruffness was lovable in a way that almost defied explanation. His complaints about the weather, the customers, the general state of everything landed as comedy not because they were crafted that way, but because underneath every single grumble you could feel something solid and warm. When Old Man passed away, the grief among the show's audience was not performative or fleeting. It was the grief people feel when they lose someone they actually knew. Because to them, in the way that television at its very best creates, he had been real. That was what Pawn Stars had built at its height, not just a popular show. Something that felt like dropping in on a family you were genuinely fond of. Something that made history feel urgent and personal and alive in a way that textbooks never managed. Rick Harrison had created something genuinely rare, a show that educated and entertained without ever appearing to try it either. And then, quietly and without any dramatic announcement, the machinery behind the show began making different decisions. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable to tell, but it needs to be told honestly, because the fans noticed. They always notice. Small things at first, the kind you want to dismiss because you're aware that you might be holding a beloved show to an impossible standard. But the small things kept arriving, kept stacking on top of each other, until the weight of them became impossible to honestly wave away. The deals began to feel rehearsed in a way they hadn't before. The sellers seemed too practiced, too comfortable with the rhythm of the cameras. The dramatic moments of discovery, which had once felt like genuine lightning strikes, started landing with the hollow echo of something hitting marks on a page. The natural friction that had made the show genuinely electric, the real tension between what a seller hoped for and what Rick would actually offer, began to feel smoothed out. Sanded down into something that moved through the same paces without generating the same feeling. And then the controversies arrived from directions nobody expected. Rick Harrison made headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with antiques or history or the art of a well-executed deal. His public statements on political matters drew sharp and divided reactions. Details from his personal life became fodder for tabloid coverage. The image of the straightforward, quietly brilliant everyman behind the counter began accumulating complications that loyal fans found genuinely difficult to reconcile with the person they believed they knew. But the hardest moment, the one that cut through everything else and demanded to be felt rather than analyzed, was the death of his son Adam Harrison. There is no framing that makes that easier to approach. It was devastating. It was real in a way that no amount of television experience prepares anyone for. A grief that exists entirely outside the reach of editing or narrative structure, the kind of loss that simply insists on being what it is. The show continued. And for a significant portion of the audience, that continuation carried an unspoken and deeply uncomfortable tension. How do you return to filming transactions and jokes and historical curiosities when something that catastrophic has happened inside the actual family at the center of it all? Some felt strongly that the show owed that grief more space. more silence, more acknowledgement that real human beings were living through something that had no television equivalent. Production moved forward instead, and that choice left behind a feeling among many longtime viewers that the machinery of the show had begun to matter more than the people it was built around. Rick appeared different on screen in the episodes that followed, more distant, less fully present in that sharp, completely engaged way that had always defined him and made him compelling to watch. Whether what viewers were sensing was grief, or exhaustion accumulated across too many seasons, or the particular heaviness that comes from carrying personal loss in a public space. It came through. The screen didn't hide it. The authenticity that had been Pawn Star's single most valuable asset had become its most pressing and unanswered question. The show is still running. Rick Harrison is still standing behind that counter. But the conversation happening around Pawn Stars has changed in a fundamental way that can't simply be reversed by a strong episode or a well-chosen item. Where fans once gathered to share genuine excitement about what might walk through that door next, they now gather to debate whether what they're watching is actually real. Whether the version of Rick they're seeing represents the man who built all of this, or a version of him that has been slowly replaced by someone going through familiar motions. Rick has spoken about his commitment to keeping the show alive, about what he owes to the crew who has built their professional lives around it, about the years of shared history that don't allow for simple exits. There is something real in that. When you have woven this much of your actual life into something, walking away carries its own complicated costs. But the viewers who genuinely grew up with Pawn Stars, who learned to look at history differently because of it, who felt connected to Old Man and Chumley and Corey the way you feel connected to people you've spent real time with, those viewers are sitting with a harder question now. Is Rick Harrison actively protecting something that still has a beating heart inside it? Or is he holding with great loyalty and effort onto the shape of something whose essential spirit has already quietly moved on? The gold and silver pawn shop still draws visitors from across the country. Rick's name still carries genuine weight in Las Vegas and far beyond it. His knowledge hasn't gone anywhere. That specific and rare ability to hold an object in his hands and trace its place in the broader sweep of human history, that skill is as present and as real today as it has ever been. But television is a fundamentally different animal than expertise. It demands presence in a particular way, vulnerability. The willingness to remain genuinely open to being caught in unguarded moments, not the practiced and polished version of yourself that extended time in front of cameras inevitably produces. The version of Rick Harrison that made Pawn Stars into something extraordinary was not performing for the camera. He was simply, completely, and without self-consciousness himself. And what fans are grieving, perhaps more than any specific format change or production decision, is the quiet but persistent feeling that the camera no longer manages to catch him that way. Legacy is a strange and complicated thing. It gets written while you are still living, still making decisions, still capable of adding to it or complicating it or pulling it in directions you didn't originally intend. Pawn Stars has a legacy already, and it is genuinely impressive by any honest measure. A pawn shop owner from Las Vegas made American history feel urgent and human and accessible to millions of people who might never have encountered it any other way. That happened. It was real. It mattered. No amount of difficult seasons or awkward headlines or disappointing episodes can reach back and unmake that. But legacies are also shaped by what comes after the peak. By the choices made when the cameras keep rolling past the point where inspiration is driving them. By the gap, sometimes narrow and sometimes enormous, between what something was at its best and what it gradually became. Rick Harrison built something that deserved to last. Whether he finds a way back to the soul of it, or whether this chapter represents a door slowly and quietly closing, is a question only the story still being written can answer. So here is what this story ultimately leaves you sitting with. When you build something with your hands and your knowledge and your family and your actual lived experience, and it grows beyond anything you dared to imagine for it, what do you owe that thing when the weight becomes heavy? When grief arrives without asking permission and the cameras keep rolling anyway? When the version of yourself that the world fell in love with feels harder and harder to locate inside the person you've become, Rick Harrison hasn't walked away. After everything, he is still there. Still behind the counter, still showing up. That means something, it has to mean something, but staying is not the same as being present. And presence, true presence, was always the thing that made this worth watching in the first place. So what do you think? Has Rick Harrison been making the right choices for the show he built with his own life? Or has Pawn Stars already crossed a line it cannot walk back across? And if it hasn't, what would it honestly take to bring it all the way back? If this story stayed with you, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us whether you're still watching, what you miss most about the early days of the show, and whether you genuinely believe Rick has one more great chapter left in him. And if you love stories that go deeper than the surface of the things you grew up watching, subscribe, because we are just getting started.